Now, we share the world with other creatures, as I'm going to call them. That's the word I'm going to use, creatures, when I want to talk about both human beings and the other animals. That is, we share the world with other living beings who are to varying degrees sentient, intelligent, and self-aware, and who find themselves, just as we find ourselves, thrown into the world and faced with the basic tasks of living, feeding themselves and raising children, and dealing with all the difficulties and dangers that arise from carrying on these tasks in a world where others are doing the same. We eat these creatures, raise them for that purpose in factory farms, force them to work for us and live with us, do experiments on them, make products out of them, decide where they may live, kill them when they interfere with our projects, and kill or injure or control them for various forms of entertainment and sport. These practices raise some pretty obvious moral questions. And in these lectures, I'll be exploring questions about whether we have duties to the other animals, what the grounds for them are, and whether any of them are the kinds of duties that can and should be enforced by the law. That is, whether the other animals do or should have legal rights. Now, in today's lecture, I'm going to begin my argument by explaining the similarities and differences between human beings and the other animals that I take to be morally significant, and saying a little about what I take their significance to be. But before I do that, I want to address a view that I think many people hold, sometimes unconsciously, and that doesn't often get articulated in philosophy. I think that most people agree that we do have some obligations to the other animals, that we ought to treat them, as we like to say, as humanely as possible. But I also think that many people suppose that this is a very weak obligation that easily gives way to nearly any human interest whose satisfaction competes with it. For instance, to our interest in finding the cures for diseases, in determining the safety of various products, and finding protein for a growing human population. What could justify the idea that animals do matter morally, but matter so little that it always gives way to our own interests? I think that many people assume that animals are simply less important and less valuable than people, and therefore that what happens to them matters less. Now, I think this is wrong, but the problem isn't that it's substantively false. The problem isn't that, by contrast, animals are just as important and valuable as people. The problem is rather that this ranking of importance doesn't make any sense at all. Now, before I explain why I think that, I want to say a little bit about what makes the idea tempting. Think about the ways that the differences between human beings and the other animals might matter to our obligations towards them. Philosophers nowadays characteristically raise the question whether we have duties to the other animals by asking whether animals have what they call moral standing. Having moral standing is usually thought of as having some property that makes you an appropriate object of direct or intrinsic moral concern. Among the popular choices for the property that confers moral standing are sentience, consciousness, rationality, self-consciousness, personhood, and having interests, leaving aside for now the question whether any of those are the same or coincide. Anyway, so one way in which the question what the differences are between human beings and the other animals might matter is this. We might believe that human beings have a property that confers moral standing on us, while the other animals lack that property. In that case, we would have no duties to animals at all. Another way the differences could matter, however, is simply in determining the details of our duties. Within the human moral community, we sometimes owe different things to different people simply because of differences in their natures or because of other facts about them. We owe gentler treatment to the fragile, or more protection to the vulnerable, or more guidance through the bureaucracy to the illiterate, say. It's obvious that even if animals do have moral standing, there'll be differences in the ways we treat people and animals that are based on the differences in their natures. In liberal societies, human beings have a whole range of rights to freedom of speech and conscience, liberty of conscience and freedom of assembly, for example. that are designed to protect our autonomy and our right to live in accordance with our own values. We need not concern ourselves with securing these kinds of rights for the other animals, who, as I will shortly argue, live in accordance with their natures, not in accordance with their values. And some of the most urgent questions about how we may treat the other animals involve differences of this kind. For example, many people believe that it does not matter to a non-human animal, in the way it does to a human being, how long she lives, or at any given moment whether she continues living. It matters to an animal that her life should be comfortable and that she should not suffer pain or fear or unnecessary constraint, but it doesn't matter to her that she should remain alive, so that our only concern about killing her should be whether it's done humanely. But continuing life does matter to human beings who have projects to carry out, relationships we want to maintain, loved ones we want to stay near, and various milestones we hope to meet. So many people think. For myself, I think that in many cases, the continuation of life might matter more to a human being than to another animal for reasons of this kind. But I think that the absence of those reasons doesn't mean that a long and happy life isn't better for an animal than a short one. But this is a question about which even humane thinkers may disagree. Obviously, it's an important question because it bears on the issue whether or not killing animals when they're still young enough to make for good eating can be made acceptable by treating them humanely during their lives and killing them in a merciful way. So even if animals have moral standing, the differences between people and animals can lead to important differences in what counts as treating them acceptably or not. Okay, now I've just described two very different ideas. The idea that there's a difference in moral standing between people and animals, and the idea that we have different kinds of duties to people and animals because of differences in their natures. I think, however, that people tend to run these two different ideas together and to conclude that animals have moral standing but have something like less of it than other people. That animals are in some general sense less important than people. And I think that's a confusion. Suppose you do believe that it's all right to kill an animal so long as you do it humanely, for the reasons I mentioned before. If the reason you believe that is you think that an ongoing life is not as important to the animal as it would be to a person, your view does not and need not involve the idea that the animal is less important or has a lesser standing than the person. You're treating the person and the animal equally insofar as you accord to each what you suppose is important to her. This is an important part of Peter Singer's point in Animal Liberation when he declares that all animals are equal. Now here's another thought that's important to distinguish from the thought that moral standing comes in degrees. I mentioned cases in which we treat people differently because of differences in their nature, like fragility or vulnerability, or because of other facts about them, such as being unable to read. Perhaps more often, however, when we treat people differently, it's because of the special relations in which we stand to them. Most of us believe that we owe different things to friends and family than to strangers, or to our fellow citizens than to non-nationals, say. And we sometimes describe these differences by saying, for instance, that our friends and family are more important to us than strangers. Exactly how to understand this kind of partiality and when and why we're permitted to act on it is a contested question in moral philosophy. But although there's room for argument about this, most of us think that exercising this kind of partiality in certain well-defined circumstances is perfectly compatible with regarding everyone as having equal moral standing. To say that someone is more important to you is not to say that he's more important absolutely. By contrast, people who think their own children or their own nation or members of their own race or ethnic group are literally more important than others, not just more important to them, but more important, period, commit what most of us regard as some of the very gravest wrongs. Could this kind of partiality be at work in our dealings with the other animals? I suppose there might be circumstances in which a sense of solidarity with our own kind might reasonably enter into moral deliberation. Epidemiological emergencies or rats and mice infecting our granaries come to mind as possible examples. Suppose a certain species of animal is infecting human beings with some dangerous form of influenza, or the rats are breeding rapidly in our barns, and we decide to kill large numbers of them to defend ourselves. We might do this for the reason I mentioned before, because we think the continuation of their lives is less important to them than the continuation of our lives is to us, and it's a case in which we have to choose. But we might also do it with some sense that in situations where the issue is one of self-defense in an emergency, we might legitimately prefer our own species, just as we legitimately prefer our own families in certain kinds of emergencies. I'm not necessarily advocating that position about these examples. I'm actually not very confident of these particular examples. I mention them only to point out that if we did legitimately prefer human beings to the other animals for reasons of solidarity or partiality in situations of this kind, it would not necessarily imply that we think humans are more important than animals. It would only imply that this is one of the situations in which we think we are allowed to prefer those who are more important to us. So we should not confuse the thought that we owe different things to animals than to people, or the thought that we may sometimes legitimately exercise a partiality to our own species, with the thought that human beings are more important than animals generally. Those are all quite different ideas. Now, I've been showing you how we might arrive at the mistaken idea that human beings are more important than animals, but I haven't yet said why I think it's a mistake. Here's the reason. I believe that nothing can be important without being important to someone or something, usually to some creature, to some person or animal. If that's right, we need to be more specific about what exactly the claim of superior human importance is supposed to be. To whom are human beings supposed to be more important? To the universe? To God? To ourselves? Obviously, as individuals, we may be more important to ourselves than other people are, just as our families may be more important to us than outsiders. And in certain circumstances, the fate of humanity may be more important to us than the fate of some other species. But as I've just been suggesting, the fact that something is more important to us justifies only a limited form of partiality in certain well-defined circumstances. After all, the fact that something is more important to me may not be the least bit important to the other people and animals with whom I'm dealing. Now, there are two inferences you might draw from the point I've just been making, and it's important to distinguish between them and draw the right one. You might think that what I've just said implies the view that all importance is, in a certain popular sense of the term, relative. Then you will think what I'm saying is that there are things that are important to me and things that are important to you, but there's nothing that's quite simply and absolutely important. But actually what I have in mind is a different view, which I'm going to call the view that all importance is tethered. In particular, it is tethered to the creature for whom the issue is important, and it cannot be cut loose from that creature without ceasing to be important at all. Although the view that importance is tethered denies that there's such a thing as free-floating importance, it doesn't have to imply that nothing is important absolutely. That's because it still might make perfectly good sense to say that there are things that are important to all of us, to everyone for whom things can be important. In fact, if you think about it, you'll see that this is all we could want from a notion of absolute importance, and nothing more. That it's something important to anyone for whom things can be important. There's no real difference between being absolute and being relative to everyone. Although we need an argument for this, it could turn out to be absolutely important in this sense that every sentient being gets the things that are most important to him or to her. But if importance is in this way tethered, we can't reach any general conclusions about whether it's more important absolutely for me to get what matters to me than it is for you to get what matters to you. And in particular, we cannot reach any conclusions about whether it's more important that human beings get what matters to us than that the other animals get what matters to them. Of course, in a given case, as it happens, there might be some third party to whom it's more important that I get what matters to me than that you get what matters to you, my mother, say. But that importance would still be tethered to that third party, and nothing in the situation requires that it be important to you what's important to her. Okay, now why does it matter if importance is tethered? John Kelsey, in The Lives of Animals, conjures up, without endorsement, an imaginary philosopher who says, "It is licit to kill animals because their lives are not as important to them as ours are to us." Now, perhaps this imaginary philosopher is just voicing the view that I mentioned earlier, that it's only the quality of life and not its duration that matters to an animal. But perhaps Kelsey's philosopher means something more radical. Maybe he means that there's some metric along which you can compare how important your life is to you to how important another animal's life is to her. And then if your life is more important to you measured by that metric, it somehow follows that it's more important absolutely. More important in some way that makes everything that happens to you more important, so that the animal's interests may always be sacrificed to yours. Does that idea make any sense? Well, first ask yourself, by what metric we might measure how important your life is to you, and compare it to how important some other animal's life is to her. Would you be willing to chew your leg off to save yourself if you got caught in a trap? How much pain are you prepared to endure in order to keep on living? How likely are you to commit suicide because you're sick of yourself and your life? How likely is your dog to do that? Or pressing in the other direction, what sorts of things are you prepared to die for because they're more important to you than life? For human beings, especially good human beings, think that many things, such as justice and the welfare of others and the salvation of the species, can be worth dying for. Well, for the other animals, life is pretty much all there is. Now, you may want to protest that last point shows that I'm missing the point Kelsey's imaginary philosopher is making. The fact that we value many things more than life itself, and the other animals don't, if it is a fact, is exactly what shows that there's a sense in which we're more important to ourselves than the other animals are. When Kelsey's imaginary philosopher talks about how important our lives are to us, he doesn't just mean how important life in the sense of a sequence of experience events is. He's talking about our lives in the sense of our existence, our very being. We treasure ourselves more. We value ourselves more. We have more meaning in our own eyes than the other animals do. The other animals just have a pleasant time or not. Well, for us human beings, existence is fraught with meaning and value. One response to this thought is to point out that our tendency to think it may just be yet another instance of the egocentric predicament, our inability to empathize with others and to grasp that the subjectivity of others is just as real as our own. In Middlemarch, George Eliot tells us the story of Dorothea, an idealistic young woman hungry to do some good in the world, who marries Casaubon, an older man, whom she conceives to be a scholar engaged in a great work. Describing a moment when Dorothea has misunderstood Casaubon's feelings, Eliot writes, "We are all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Dorothea had early begun to emerge from that stupidity, yet it had been easier to her to imagine how she would devote herself to Mr. Casaubon and become wise and strong in his strength and wisdom, than to conceive with that distinctness that is no longer reflection but feeling, an idea wrought back to the directness of sense, like the solidity of objects. that he had an equivalent center of self, whence the lights and shadows must always fall with a certain difference. Dorothea does come to comprehend Sabin's feelings. Eliot describes the moment as one of moral revelation, a moment in which Dorothea first grasps the fact that, quote, there is as great a need on his side as on her own, and so acquires a new motive. Eliot here is reminding us just how hard it is to keep in view, not just to tell yourself, but to feel with the directness of sense that even other people's lives are just as important, just as real and vivid, just as fraught with meaning to them as yours is to you. It's the perpetual temptation, especially of the safe and the privileged, to harbor the thought that those less fortunate than ourselves are also simpler beings to whom the misfortune probably doesn't matter as much or in the same vivid way as it would if the same things were happening to us. It's especially easy to harbor such thoughts if the unfortunate ones are illiterate or inarticulate or unsophisticated, or if they are in some other way alien, such as being of a different race. It's easy to assume without realizing it that having to work 15-hour days or losing yet another child to malaria or dying young can't really matter to the people these things happen to quite as much as it would matter to you if you were in their place, and therefore it's easy to be insufficiently struck with the hardness or tragedy of their experience. How much harder, then, must it be to wrap our minds around the ways in which beings of a different species, whose minds are deeply alien to our own, might experience their own fates in their own existence, and how important they might be to themselves. Now, for all that, I think there's something right about the claim that we human beings matter to ourselves and value ourselves in a way that's quite different from the way the other animals do, as I'll soon explain. But this does not have the implication that what happens to us matters more than what happens to our fellow creatures. If importance is tethered, then even if we did matter more or in a different way to ourselves than the other animals do to themselves, this wouldn't mean that we mattered more absolutely. But the special way that human beings value themselves need not matter to the other animals at all. But before I go on, I want to make sure that my message has been clear. I have not been arguing that animals are just as important as people. I've been arguing that the comparison is incoherent. If everything that's important is important to someone, to some person or animal, there's just no place to stand and make a comparative and absolute judgment about the importance of creatures themselves. But anyway, let's cut to the chase and talk about why anything is important at all. In arguing that the importance of something is always tethered to some creature, I've already given you a clue as to what I think the answer is. I think that there are things that matter because there are entities to whom things matter. Which entities are these? They're the entities for whom things can be good or bad. I intend that remark to be a matter of definition, not a substantive claim. When I say that something is important to a person or an animal, I don't mean that she necessarily thinks about it or gives it a high deliberative priority or is inclined to insist on it or anything like that. I just mean that it's the sort of thing that can be very good or very bad for her. Not everything that's good or bad for you is important, but everything that's important to some creature is good or bad for that creature in some way. So I'll switch the question and ask, who are the entities for whom things can be good or bad in a way that might matter morally? And the answer I'm about to argue is basically animals, creatures, including ourselves. And this remark, as we'll see, is also intended to be pretty much true by definition, because there's a very tight connection between the concept of an animal, at least on one philosophical conception of it, and the concept of a being for whom things can be good or bad, a being who, as I will put it, has a good. I said a moment ago that animals almost by definition have a good in the sense that might matter morally. Now that qualification, that might matter morally, is necessary because we use the word good in two different ways, each of which is associated with its own sense of good for. First, good is our most general term of positive evaluation, a term we apply to nearly every kind of thing for which we have any use or with which we interact. Think of the wide variety of things that we evaluate as good or bad. Cars and houses, machines and instruments, dogs and cats, food, weather, days, prose, pictures, movies, people considered as occupying various roles or having jobs, just mother, teacher, son, president, carpenter, people considered just as people, among many other things. Those are all things that can be evaluated as good or bad. I'm going to call that the evaluative, or for reasons I will explain shortly, the functional sense of good. I'm going to call good in the second sense in which we use the term the final sense of good. We call something good in the final sense when we consider it worth having, realizing, or bringing about for its own sake. We suppose that something we call the good, or in our own case, the human good, is the end and aim of all our strivings, or at any rate the crown of their success, the summum bonum, a state of affairs that is desirable or valuable or worth achieving for its own sake. Final goods are the ends of action. Now you should ask yourself, why do we use the same word, good, as both our most general term of positive evaluation and to designate the ends in action and the general end of all our strivings? What do the two uses have in common? I think most people think that the answer to that question is obvious. In both cases, they think we're using the term evaluatively. That is, they think when we use the word good to mean a final good, that's just a special case of the evaluative good, one in which what we're evaluating is a person's ends and his life as a whole, when we say he had a good life. That seems reasonable, but there's a puzzle about how exactly we're supposed to go about evaluating lives and ends. As Plato and Aristotle pointed out long ago, evaluation is usually related to the purpose, role, function of the entity that's judged good or bad. An entity is good in the evaluative sense when it has the properties that enable it to serve its function, either its usual or natural function or one that we've assigned to it for some special reason. A good knife is sharp because the function of knives is cutting. A good teacher is clear because the function of a teacher is to help her students understand. A good car handles easily, gets good gas mileage, and goes fast because the function of the car is to get people quickly and safely to destinations they can't reach on foot. These things are evaluated as good because they have the properties that enable them to perform their functions well. But what is the function of an end or a life? Ends and lives don't seem to have functions. In fact, to say that something is an end and not a means is precisely to say that we don't value it just because of some purpose that it serves. But then how are we evaluating an end or a life when we say that it's good? To what standard are we appealing, if not a functional one? One thing that seems clear is that when we say that a life is good, in the sense we want now, the sense that allows us to say that it is good for the creature in a sense that might matter morally, we're looking for a standard that makes it good from the point of view of that creature. After all, life could be good from some other point of view, as the farmer values the life of his cow, but that doesn't give us the sense that supports the idea that the life is good for the cow. This thought, the thing that's good in the right way has to be good from the creature's point of view, turns out to be the key to solving this problem. First, notice that the evaluative or functional sense of good, the sense in which a good knife is sharp and a good car handles well, also supports the notion of good for in a way. A thing is good when it has the properties that enable it to perform its function well. If that's true, then the conditions and actions that tend to give rise to those properties or to enable it to maintain them count as good for it. In this sense, which I'm going to call the functional sense of good for, it might be good for your knife to get sharpened regularly and bad for your knife to be used on material that tends to dull its blade. A certain kind of gas might be good for your car, and it might be bad for your car to leave it sitting idle too long. When we use the concept of good for in this way, we refer to activities or conditions that maintain or promote the ability of the car to function well, of the knife or the car to function well. But of course, we don't mean that they're good from the point of view of the knife or the car, since knives and cars have no point of view. All right, now with that in mind, think about what an animal is. Aristotle taught us that it's possible to view living organisms as having a function, which he defined as that of maintaining their own forms. His idea was this: everything, every substance, whatever, can be seen as having both a form and a matter. The matter is the material or the parts of which it's made, and the form is the way the parts are put together, which is what makes it the kind of thing that it is. In particular, the form is what enables it to serve its function. So, for instance, we might say that the matter of a house is a roof, walls, windows, and doors. Those are the parts. Line the walls up corner to corner, put the roof over the top, insert the door into one of the walls so you can go in and out, and behold, you have an object that can function as a shelter in which people can keep themselves and their things safe from other people and animals and the weather. Aristotle was also impressed by the fact that living organisms are made of fragile materials that are constantly being used up as energy or worn out or damaged in various ways. But organisms constantly take in new materials from the environment through the nutritive process and turn those materials into fresh parts of themselves to replace the ones that are always getting used up, thus keeping themselves, for a while at least, in existence. Furthermore, organisms also make new kinds of things like themselves, things with the same form as themselves, through reproduction. So Aristotle observed that we can explain a great deal about living organisms if we view them as objects that have the function of maintaining their own forms in these two senses. They keep themselves in existence, and they maintain their species by producing other members of their kind. When we view an organism as a functional object in this way, then it's like any other functional object in this sense. We can see the conditions that enable it to perform its function, to stay alive and reproduce, as things that are good for it in the functional sense. But there are two important differences between animals and the kinds of functional objects that I referred to before, knives and cars. The first actually applies to organisms generally. Although we're getting better at producing machines that are in various ways self-maintaining, generally speaking, a knife doesn't sharpen itself, and a car doesn't seek out the best quality of gasoline. But a living organism often does do things of that kind. So there's something special about the way that organisms function, which is by tending to their own well-functioning. In fact, unlike a knife or a car, that is their function, to look after their own well-functioning, or their own and that of their species. After all, that's really all that organisms do. They look after themselves and their offspring, and so keep themselves and their kind in being. When we say that rain and sunshine are good for the plants, we're using the term good for in this functional sense of good for. We mean that the rain and the sunshine are helping the plants to maintain those properties that enable the plants to perform their function, which is simply to stay alive and reproduce. So the first difference between things like knives and cars and organisms is that organisms take care of themselves. The second difference is distinctive of animals. An animal, at least as I'm using the term here, is a particular kind of living organism. An animal is an organism that functions, at least in part, by representing the world to herself through her senses and then acting in light of those representations. She's guided by her representations to get the things that are good for her and avoid the things that are bad for her in the functional sense of good for and bad for. In order for an animal's representational system to do its evolutionary job, however, the animal's representational system has to have what we might call a valenced character. The things she encounters in the world have to strike her as attractive or aversive, welcome or unwelcome in particular ways, depending on whether or how they're good or bad for her. She has to be drawn by the way the world appears to her to seek out the things that are good for her and to avoid the things that are bad. So she has to perceive the world evaluatively as a place full of things that are to be sought out and things that are to be avoided, and so of things that are good and bad, but not now only in the functional sense, now in the final sense too, as the ends of action. Because that's how an animal works. That's part of how she functions. A well-functioning animal likes to eat when she's hungry, is eager to mate, feeds and cares for her offspring, works assiduously to keep herself clean and healthy, fears her enemies, and avoids the sources of injury. Now don't say, well, of course she does. Allow yourself to be struck by the fact that there are entities that stand in this relation to themselves and their own condition. Because what I'm saying is that an animal functions in part by making her own well-functioning, the things that are good for her in the functional sense, an end of action, a thing to go for, a final good. In fact, it's a necessary truth that for an animal that functions by enjoying her own well-functioning, life is a good so long as she's well-functioning. The final good came into the world with animals, because an animal is pretty much by definition the kind of thing that has a final good, a good in the sense that might matter morally. All right, so now let me come back to the question from which I started. By what standard are we evaluating a creature's life or her ends or her condition when we say that they're good in the final sense of good? The standard is actually one of empathy, because we're looking at the creature's functional good as if through her own eyes, in the way she looks at it herself, as it's something worth pursuing for its own sake. All right, now 3 important caveats. First, I'm not saying that animals think of things this way or that they use the concept of good. What I'm saying is just that that's how they work, by taking the things that promote their own functional goods as the ends of action, by finding these things attractive and the opposites aversive. Second caveat, it's important to notice that considered as functional devices designed to take care of themselves, animals are very faulty. They evolve in one set of conditions, and as soon as those conditions change, they start to function less well than they did before. So when we say what's good for an animal, we don't say that anything she finds attractive is good for her and anything she finds aversive is bad. The desirable is not the good. We have to say instead that what's good for her is what she would find attractive if she were well functioning, and what's bad is what she would find aversive. And I'll say more in defense of that tomorrow. And third, when we apply this story to the question of what is good for a human being, we have to take into account that what counts as well-functioning for complicated creatures like ourselves is itself a very complicated matter. Now, I realize that what I've been saying sounds a bit metaphysical, but it's really quite simple. Things only matter, they're only important because they're beings to whom they're important. These are the beings for whom things can be good or bad. The sense of good for that we want here is a sense that brings in the point of view of the creature for whom things can be good or bad. Animals are pretty much by a definition beings who have a point of view on the things that are good or bad for them in the functional sense, because the way that they function is by being guided by that point of view. They find the things that are good for them appealing and the things that are bad for them repugnant. And importantly, they experience their own good condition their own well-functioning as a good thing, an end of action. For a healthy animal, life and existence are themselves good things, because that's how they work, by finding life and existence desirable. That's why sometimes when things are going especially well for you, you express that by saying, I really feel alive, because that's what the good is. You feel the life functioning well, life processes at work within you, and because of the way you are made, you welcome it with every fiber of your being. It is because there are such creatures that there are final goods in the world. And since final goods are what make things important, that means the only reason why anything is important is because animals, including ourselves, exist. It's because we're animals and not because we're people that we ourselves have a good, although our being people affects its particular character. But as I said before, if we're going to extend this account to the case of human beings, we do have to keep in mind that what counts as being well-functioning in our own case involves some special complications. This brings me to the question of human-animal differences and how they might matter to our subject. I said before that if an animal is to be guided through the world by perception, her responses to the world must be ones of attraction and aversion. I want to be more specific now about what I have in mind. A non-human animal, I believe, lives in a world that is in a certain way her own world, a world that's for that animal. I don't mean by saying this that the animal's world is favorable to her interests. Often it's not. What I mean is that the world as perceived by the animal is organized around her interests. It consists of her food, her enemies, her potential mates, and if she is social, her fellows, her flock, tribe, or what have you. To say this is just to say that the animal's representations of things come already loaded with the practical significance of various objects for her. She confronts a world of things that are perceived directly, without calculation or conscious interpretation, as things that are to be avoided or to be chased or to be investigated or to be eaten or to be fled from or to be cared for, and so on. If you think of it, you'll see that it has to be this way. Perception first evolved in unintelligent animals, and it would have been useless if all it did was flood their minds with neutral information that needs to be processed by reason or intelligence before it's of any use. So the world comes to an animal already practically interpreted as a world of resources and obstacles, of friends and enemies, of the to be avoided and the to be sought. The natural way of perceiving the world, as I will put it, is teleologically. That is, everything has a place in a purposive order determined by the instincts of the perceiving animal herself. Now, as I've just suggested, we can use the word instinct for this way of perceiving and responding to the world. And it'll be convenient to do so, since instinctive naturally contrasts to rational, and that's the thing I'm about to claim is different about us. But before I can use these words, I need to put some warning labels on them. People sometimes use the word instinctive to describe reactions and movements that are wholly automatic and simply caused, like ducking or salivating. I'm not talking about reactions of that kind, or not limited. What I'm talking about isn't limited to reactions of that kind. But it'll be easier to make it clear what I'm trying to get at when I add my other warning label. People sometimes contrast an instinctive response to an intelligent or a learned response, and I'm not doing that either. As I'm using the term, being instinctive is compatible with being intelligent, but being intelligent is not the same thing as being rational. An intelligent animal is characterized by his ability to learn from his experiences and perhaps to solve problems by taking thought. He is able to extend his repertoire of practically significant representations beyond those with which instinct originally supplied him. He learns to see the porcupine as something that is to be avoided, or the human companion as a member of the flock. Intelligence, so understood, is not something contrary to instinct, but something that increases its range and ramifies the practical view of the world that it presents. But intelligence on this showing is not the same thing as rationality. Rationality, as I understand it, is a normative power grounded in a certain form of self-consciousness. A rational animal is one who is aware of the grounds of her beliefs and actions, or rather of what would be their grounds if she were not so aware. This puts her in a position to evaluate those grounds and decide whether they count as good reasons to act and believe or not. When an animal thinks about what to do, if she thinks about what to do, she thinks about things in the world as she perceives them, not about her own attitudes towards those things. The attitudes that motivate her actions may be invisible to her because they're part of the lens through which she sees the world, rather than being part of the world that she sees. We sometimes talk about our own attitudes as if they were disguised from us in this way. If you say that a spider is creepy, for instance, you speak as if your attitude towards the spider were a property of the spider itself, rather than a lens through which you see it. When an antelope flees from a lion, she's afraid, but she doesn't need to think about the fact that she's afraid, or that fear is what's making her run. But we are or can be aware of the attitudes that motivate our actions. We may know in these kinds of circumstances that we're afraid and that fear is making us want to run. And that opens up a whole new range of questions, normative questions. Not only whether a lion is a good thing to run away from, but whether a lion is a good thing to fear, and even if it is appropriate to fear the lion, whether fear in these circumstances is a good reason to run. And if we are, as we take ourselves to be, rational beings, then what we actually do will be influenced by the way we answer these questions. We will, for instance, stand our ground if we decide that either we have reason not to be afraid or reason not to run, even if fear is in order. Of course, reason doesn't always triumph over instinct in this way, but it can. So the difference here is this. Intelligence looks outward to the world and asks and answers questions about the connections and relations we find there. Most obviously causal relations, but also spatial and temporal and sometimes social relations. But rationality looks inwards at the workings of our own minds and asks and answers questions about the connections and relations we find there. In particular, rationality raises questions about whether the attitudes that motivate our actions give us good reasons to act or not. Now, obviously, I can't on this occasion present a theory about how exactly we make those decisions. That would be a theory of what the laws of reason are. But supposing that there are such laws, then we can decide what counts as a good reason to act and be motivated accordingly. And this makes two very important differences in the form that human life takes. First of all, when we endorse our motives and decide we have reason to act on them, we judge their objects to be good. That is, now we don't merely desire them, we value them. Because that, roughly speaking, is what valuing is. Not merely wanting something, but approving and endorsing your own desire for it, and disapproving those who are indifferent to it or against it. So rationality introduces us into the world of self-conscious valuing. And second, when we become aware that we can evaluate the motives of our actions, and act differently as a result of that evaluation, we become aware in a way the other animals are not, that our actions are our own, that we are their sources and authors, that they're up to us. Or rather, to put the point more properly, it becomes true that our actions are up to us. This is most obvious when you decide that the motive on which you're tempted to act is not a good reason for doing what you're tempted to do. If you can override your own instinctive desires when you think that acting on them would be wrong, then you're responsible for what you do. You've become a normatively self-governing being. In Immanuel Kant's phrase, an autonomous being. One who governs himself by what he takes to be the laws of reason. If moral principles are among those rational principles, as Kant himself believed, This is what makes you a moral animal. So rational capacities are what makes us persons in one familiar sense of the term, normatively self-governing beings. And a further difference follows. Turning an evaluative eye onto our own motives and actions, while at the same time coming to see those actions as expressive of ourselves, amounts to turning an evaluative eye onto ourselves. Regarding ourselves as the sources and authors of our actions, and our actions themselves as good or bad, is in effect regarding ourselves as good or bad. When we take responsibility for our actions, we see ourselves, say, as courageous or cowardly, noble or small-minded, selfish or generous, or just plain good or bad, depending on how we act. People often ask whether there are any big differences between human beings and the other animals. And I have to admit that it surprises me that this particular difference so seldom comes up. I don't mean rationality, people often mention that, but the normative or evaluative self-conception to which rationality gives rise. Because if this is indeed a difference between human life and the lives of the other animals, it's an enormous difference. Normative or evaluative self-conception does not find its expression in morality alone. It shows up in phenomena as primitive as a teenager's desire to be cool, or a ruffian's desire to be manly, or a housewife's desire to be in style. Thinking well of yourself and thinking that others think well of you are the source of some of the human being's most exquisite pleasures, and the opposite, the source of some of our worst torments. Feeling unappreciated by others is a source of enormous bitterness for many people. People can be driven to despair or suicide by the thought that they are worthless or useless or unlovely. None of this, I believe, is true of animal life. I feel tempted to say that unlike us, the other animals accept themselves, but of course that isn't the right way to put it. They don't evaluate themselves at all. A life led in the light or the shadow of an evaluative conception of the self is a very different kind of life from the one that most animals lead. Now this complicates what counts as the good for us, because it gives us a whole new way of functioning well or badly. But some people are tempted to think that it does something else as well. Recall again Ketsy's imaginary philosopher, who thinks we're more important to ourselves than the other animals are to themselves. I raise the possibility that the reason we're tempted to think that is that we suppose our lives are suffused with meaning and value, while the lives of the other animals are not. I think that I've just described the source of that thought. It derives from the implications of our personhood, from the evaluative stance that we take on ourselves. We do matter to ourselves in a different way than the other animals do. But does the fact that we are persons in this sense give us a special moral standing and make us more important than the other animals? I believe the answer to that is still no. Being persons, having a moral nature, is not a form of human superiority. When I claim that human beings are moral animals, of course I don't mean that human beings are morally good. I mean that only human beings can perform the kinds of actions that can be either morally good or bad, because only human beings have the kind of self-consciousness that makes it possible to evaluate your reasons. So being a person means being capable of being either morally good or morally evil. Now, one creature may be superior to another when there's a standard that they both must meet, and one meets it and the other doesn't, or one meets it to a greater extent than the other. And one creature may be superior to another when there's a capacity that they both have, and one has developed it more fully than another. But one creature is not superior to another when the capacities they have and the standards that apply to them are simply different. That's just a difference and nothing more. So moral life and non-moral life being a life governed by desires and instincts, and moral life being a life governed by values, are or may be two very different forms of life. but one of them is no more superior or inferior to the other than life on land is superior to life in the sea. Our moral nature, our personhood, is not the grounds for claiming special privileges with respect to our fellow creatures, or the right to use them any way we please. Instead, it is the ground of the fact that we have duties to the other animals, or so I shall argue tomorrow. Thank you.